This was at a time when I was really struggling to find my footing when it came to my identity, asking myself the big questions of who am I and how do I fit in? I'm sure at one point you probably asked yourself those very same questions. Hey friends, welcome to the One Step Podcast, where we share stories of change makers in different fields, whether in business, nonprofits, etc., so you can gain practical insights for your one step in creating change, whether you're first or you're next. And today we are switching it up a bit. Our community has been growing, and it's safe to say that not everyone is familiar with who I am or why I even started this podcast in the first place. And so I'm hoping that this episode would serve not only as a reference, but also encourage you out of my own story. Now, I will say up front, this episode might get pretty raw. If I haven't had the pleasure to meet you, my name is Jonathan. I'm a South Florida native, and I know everybody loves to make fun of Florida. And yes, even I'll admit that we have our own quirks. I mean, Florida man is a real thing, but there's nothing like the beach, the culture, and so many other special things that make up this place. On top of that, I'm also the middle child of two other brothers. Any other middle child out there knows what it's like. I mean, the struggle is real. Well, a big part of my story that I have been public about before is I grew up with an abusive father. Now, fortunately for my brothers and I, it never got to being physical, but for my mother, it was a different story. To give an idea, my father introduced my brothers and I to pornography at a young age and tried to make a teaching lesson out of it. At bare minimum, you can say he wasn't mentally well. Well, fast forward to early middle school, my parents divorced, and as a young person, this took a heavy toll on me, especially since I would still need to see my father in his own space for the next few years. I remember this one time when my father told me that just because my brothers and I would be raised by my mother during her days of the week, that all we would amount to is becoming the biggest gangsters in Florida. Looking back now, I sometimes joke around saying, man, well, he probably just saw how much of an OG I am. But all jokes aside, this was at a time when I was really struggling to find my footing when it came to my identity, asking myself the big questions of who am I and how do I fit in? I'm sure at one point you probably asked yourself those very same questions. And can we be honest? Trying to answer those questions while navigating our culture is tough. And I don't know about you, but it always seemed that culture was so loud as far as to how I should act, what I should say, and always seemed to try to put a label on me. And I've never been the type of person that you could fit into a box, especially with a single label. After a series of events and some therapy, I began really taking steps to solidify my identity, experience healing, and genuinely be myself despite what others have expected from me. Now, it wasn't perfect nor linear. There were definitely seasons of messing up, making mistakes, and learning from those mistakes. And so you might ask, well, Jonathan, what is it that made the changes? Well, in the journey, I gained faith. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to push anything on you, but I wouldn't be authentic if I didn't mention how this was the biggest catalyst in my life. I discovered that we could experience real hope in this life, even through the challenges we may face. Through the journey, I connected with phenomenal men, women, and peers who championed me in my journey. And I don't find it a coincidence how in nearly every interview I've had so far for this podcast mentions the importance about having the right people in your life. There were men who to this day served as father figures for my life, modeling what true manhood is all about, how it all comes down to being a man who honors and serves others. I looked at their lives and how they served their communities, engaged their spouses if they were married, and led their families. And ultimately, seeing and wanting to be like these healthier examples led me to be curious. And so I started asking questions. John Maxwell, he said before that good leaders ask great questions. And I knew that I had to be transparent, admitting what I don't know. Thankfully, these men and women made themselves available as I fumbled through, calling up the things in my life that I didn't see or believe in myself, and being present as I navigated some real challenges. One tip I picked up along the way is a quote from a man named Craig Rochelle, and he says this. He says, quote, "Asking someone to mentor you will intimidate many people because they either feel like they don't have the time or don't know how. Instead of asking someone to mentor you, consider asking them to lunch or breakfast or set up a 20-minute chat over coffee. Prepare questions and then be ready to listen." And I realized that people are people. They are just as human as me. And so I can learn something from nearly everyone, from the person who is in close proximity to me to even the person who I believe is so out of reach. And so I just want to encourage you, just reach out, whether through LinkedIn or approaching the person from face to face. I remember there was this one time when I wrote a letter to someone who at the time was working for Airbnb in California. And it was because of that letter that this person got back to me. And so you never know. I would just encourage you, hey, just to reach out, to step outside of your comfort zone in doing so. Everyone had their particular strengths. Some were strong in the areas when it comes to relationships. Others showed me what it's like to listen and be present. And then others were stronger in the areas of career and business, and the list goes on and on. What I do know is I wouldn't be where I am today without the grace of God, my mother, and the investment that people have made in my life. Because I've been a recipient, I find the opportunity to extend that to others a privilege, both in my everyday life, serving others and striving to make a broader impact. And here's what I believe to my very core, that wherever you may find yourself, that life change is possible for you and through your story. And it's true. We may have very different backgrounds. I may not know exactly where you're coming from, but I've seen it time and time again in people's lives where their story, even with very real challenges, have taken a turn for the better, where their mess became their greatest message. So why did I start this podcast? Well, as many of you know, I'm going to be running the New York Marathon this November, fundraising for a nonprofit called Charity Water. You can find out more info at onesteppodcast.com/marathon. But the whole reason why I created this podcast is to inspire listeners to recognize that we don't have to wait for one day to create a change in our own lives or create an impact in the lives around us. There's an artist named Andy Mineo, and he says in one of his songs, "If nothing changes before I'm gone, there's no one else I could blame it on. We've been waiting way too long. What if we are the ones we've been waiting on?" And I so believe that creating change begins and continues with one step. We can have a purpose in our lives bigger than just ourselves. I believe that as we continue this journey, learning from and encouraging one another, as we make progress in our own lives and share what we gain as we serve others, that the story of our lives would be memorable ones. And especially as we play a part in the larger narrative of leaving the world better than how we found it. And friend, I want to encourage you in this, that your story is still being written. If I can leave you with one step, it would be this: get outside of your comfort zone to go ask questions and act on it. And I'll tell you, I definitely don't have all the answers, but I don't believe we actually need to. Instead, I believe that's exactly what makes the journey worthwhile. Recognizing that where I am today doesn't have to be where I'll always be. I know this episode was a shorter one, and I'll tell you, I'm truly grateful that you are a part of this community. I look forward to seeing the impact we're going to be making together and the stories we're going to hear from this journey. Thank you for listening to the One Step Podcast. Consider subscribing and follow on social media at One Step Podcast so you don't miss future insights for your one step in creating change. That's the number One Step Podcast. If you would like to be a part of creating change, you can visit onesteppodcast.com/charitywater. As you are on your journey, trust the process, because change begins and continues with one step.